Lord be with you.
Also with you.
I love that works in this tradition.
I know.
That is fantastic. And also with you, welcome to another Sunday morning speaker series here at St. Luke's on another very cold, brisk, early cold morning here in November. Last week, admittedly, we covered a lot of ground. I went back and watched myself, and I was like, wow, there was a lot of statistics and a lot of numbers and a lot of graphs. So you are all champions for joining with me on that fast trek as we tried to frame the religious situation of the landscape of America today. If you need to be refreshed on any of those, I would encourage you all to go back and watch that episode. Don't worry about watching the whole thing, just scrub it. Go to whatever part you may have missed or need reminders on, because I'm not going to have any time to review a lot of that stuff today. What we want to go about today is really where I get the name for this presentation, faithful or faithless. So we're going to be talking about these aspects of faithfulness in non-religious persons. In preparation for today, it reminded me of the defense that I did for my ministry thesis project. And the way a defense works is you arrive at the school and you're invited to a room and you have to sit around with your committee around a table and basically talk about your project. You get to describe it and talk about how you went about your project, its methods and its means, and then they get to ask you questions about it. And one of the most rewarding parts for me of this process was when we started talking about the actual work that I did, which was chapter 4 of my thesis project. And I remember one of the readers, an Old Testament professor, he said to me, what I really enjoyed about your thesis was this entire chapter 4, as I was reading through the examples you were giving, I kept thinking about my own family. What you were writing wasn't foreign to me. I thought about family and friends and relatives, that even as you were describing the stories of people you were speaking with, they were coming to mind as this relating to them. I could see this in their lives. And that was an affirmation for me that I'd listened during my study. That I'd heard people's stories. That I had my pulse on the sort of religious expression and sentiment that wasn't just anecdotal to my study or anecdotal to some of the studies I talked about last week, but it was faith expressions that people could see in the lives of people that were close to them. So what I want to focus on this morning is stories. Now, some of the words kind of seem big, like faith of the faithless. That's an interesting concept, signals of transcendence. But really what we want to do is turn our direction towards the stories of this segment we talked about as non-religious persons last week. We want to give some real life to all of the statistics and all of the data and all of the tables and charts. So the first thing I want to clarify, and what may have been lost in some of the statistics last week, and it kind of gets confusing when you talk about people who have no religious preference or who are, quote, non-religious, is we bring to it this assumption that these individuals are therefore not spiritual or don't have any sort of religious habits. So the first thing we need to be clear on this morning is that no religious preference doesn't mean that there's no religious or spiritual practices that are present. Because often spirituality is remade or created, just in different ways. And this is especially true for older generations. So last week we talked about Generation X, and we talked about millennials, talked about Gen Z. Well, in Generation X and in the boomer generation, spirituality is often remade whenever they leave a religious tradition. So what that may look like is someone who was Catholic, and now they no longer attend Mass, but they still have Catholic practices in their own personal piety. And then they may blend in with other things that they come across through various traditions and various resources. Or if it's someone who is part of the mainline group that may have left the mainline religious tradition, a lot of times they'll maintain a sense of their Protestant Christianity. They may follow the teachings of Jesus. They may still observe the Ten Commandments. They may pray. They may keep aspects of morning prayer. But then they're also going to blend it with other things like meditation, nature walks, and even sometimes picking things from other religious faith expressions. So just because nons fit under this category, or individuals fit under this category of non-religious, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not spiritual. So remember what Drescher said last week, and that's going to be our next slide. To be non is a relational category. It's not necessarily an abandonment of God or a denial of faith. So this was the quote that I put up last week from Elizabeth Drescher's book, Choosing Our Religion, and I brought that again in case anybody wanted to get this as a reference. This is a great ethnographic study and interviews with people who identify as non-religious, most of whom left religious traditions. In this book, she has this quote: "To be unaffiliated means simply that a person is not a member of an institutional religious group. Being non is also a matter of social identity." This is important. Social identity of a person who understands herself most authentically to be in relationship to others. So one of the questions that I got after our session last week was, and maybe even during the session too, was why do people become non-religious? And remember I gave the example of politics in the mid-90s. That when one form of theology or faith becomes identified with Christianity, for people that may hold a different form of politics, they may feel they no longer belong in the Christian faith. So they may leave. Many sociologists have written about this. So that's an example of this group of people must believe this. If they believe this for religion, then they believe this for politics, and I can no longer fit in that group. So I have to leave the group. They may have still maintained their faith, but they can't identify inside that group anymore. So they become non-religious. This is also the way we can think about younger generations. As we talked about last week, remember, about half of all millennials and Gen Z are non-religious. And most of them have extremely thin religious or spiritual attachments. We like to think that perhaps maybe they came to, the use of reason or intellect or study to come to those conclusions. But it could be that generation culturally is like that. So it's not necessarily an act of will for younger generations. They chose to be non-religious. That's just the cultural ethos that they swim in. Their group identifies that way. So this is an important distinction because when you're talking with people who no longer have a preference or don't go to church, you can't make a lot of assumptions until you listen to the stories. Listening is key because there may be a lot there below the surface if we'll listen, if we'll ask questions, if we'll engage. So remember that to be unaffiliated simply means they're not a member of a religious group, and it's a matter of more social identity than a negation of spirituality or faith or belief in God. Now there are a couple of things that determine whether certain practices become meaningful spiritually. So what sorts of qualities do practices have that make them meaningful for nones? And I briefly want to go through this just so you can see the character and nature of practices that they ascribe as being spiritually significant. Number one, it's things that are relational and not individualistic. So it's social and experiential. This is going to be key for our presentation today. It's practices that are embedded in everyday life. Practices embedded in everyday life, not otherworldly. So they're provisional and practical. What I want us to see in that means they're not absolute. They can change. As life changes, the things that feel spiritual can change. So they're not absolute. They're provisional and they're practical. And they can be drawn from multiple resources, like I talked about a minute ago in terms of philosophical, religious, or whatever, to construct their new forms of faith and religion. They're dynamic. So again, they're not static for all time and eternity. They're transformational. So when I see that word, that means to me, there's an aspect of conversion to them. Practices that change us. They're transformational, especially in regards to their personal growth or social change, communal change. And it highlights, and also these practices highlight connectedness at the present moment, not a future expectation. Now, these are categories that Drescher talks about in her study with over 70 persons who left religious traditions and identified as non. But you're going to see these same things in the research I'm going to show you this morning. These are characteristics of what people look for who are non-religious in practices that make them feel spiritual or religious or give them a sense of connectedness. So what this means is that spirituality and religion, it becomes connected to very earthy things, very material things. It's not esoteric. So things like family, friends, preparing food, eating with each other, walking in nature, music, love and our love interests, our pets even. I am not exaggerating when I suggest that these things all take on sacramental character for people who are non-religious, who don't participate in a religious tradition. So they've not always evacuated spirituality. They've not always evacuated a sense of transcendence or higher power, as we talked about last week. It's just shifted because they can no longer accept certain parameters of thought, certain doctrines, certain theologies, certain worldviews. But the need to make meaning is still there. The need to sense more than ourselves is still there. And it shifts to this. So the same sort of spiritual character that we may give to coming together on Sunday morning, or to the Eucharist, or to things like Holy Week, or the season of Advent, prayer, our acts of praise, our acts of confession. A lot of nuns ascribe that same sort of sacramentality in these kinds of acts. Very earthy, material things. And I wish I had the entire time to just go through her book and read you all of the stories that I heard from people during my studies. So please, by all means, come check out Drescher's book, because there's a lot of examples. Like there's a story on page 122 I think that we would find fascinating, but that we don't have time to really cover today. And it's replete with these kinds of examples of how connectedness around community gatherings or food preparation, socialization, social justice, whatever, give people a sense of connectedness. So what that means is when people are looking for God, most people who are non-religious, and half of America that doesn't go to church, they're looking horizontally for transcendence. They're sitting down in seats like this, and they're looking beside at who's with them and inside. They're not looking vertically. We go into the sanctuary, and our attention goes vertical. Stained glass, high windows, the rose window. Everything is vertical, lifted up. For nuns, they're looking horizontally. And that's a major distinction. But also, we look horizontally too. So it's not just one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive. It can be both and. And the reason these stories are important is because they provide an access point to what I call signals of transcendence. The stories matter because they give a thick description of our human experience that retain elements that we can't always explain but that draw us in. Godly elements. So when you listen to the stories of where individuals now feel spiritual or they feel religious, you're going to find them in movements of the human spirit, of common human experiences where something phenomenal takes place. It's kind of like weeks ago when Father Joel talked about The Muffled Presence of the Holy by Michael Maine. That's what we're looking for in these everyday common experiences. That's why listening to their stories matter, and we can't make assumptions about statistics or demographics. We have to get into the stories of people that say that they're non-religious. And I would like to suggest that this big word for a simple concept, signals of transcendence, this is where we can start to build bridges between ourselves and people who aren't here this morning for whatever reason, or not in a church, or who identify as non-religious. So one of the questions that guided my own work, my own thesis work at Mercer, was how do we build a common language that can act as a bridge between persons who don't share our theology, between ourselves and individuals who are non-religious? How do we speak? How do we engage when we have different kinds of worldviews? Is there something more going on in the everyday, mundane life that if we could get a grip on and we could see, that it would provide a means of communication for us? So are there leftovers? Are there remains? Traces of God? Traces of the divine? Traces of things that are inexplicable, even amongst some people that think everything can be explained, or more than less can be explained. And what I didn't want to get into was sort of like, the Freudian unconscious, where we're now interpreting all these acts as, oh, well, there's a Christian act, or, oh, well, there's a theological act, or, oh, you do that, so that means you believe in God. No. What we want to talk about is just everyday things that seem to signal to something more, not something that requires us to psychoanalyze or psychologize somebody. So what we wanted to look for are irreducible elements of human experience. Things not hidden. Things that are plain sight. That signal to more. And that's what we mean by signals of transcendence. And I get this language from Peter Berger's book, Rumor of Angels. He was a sociologist of religion and also a theologian. He's written a lot of books. If you like the presentation this morning, I would encourage you to Google him, check him out. He's probably got a couple dozen books he's written and or co-edited. But he coined the term signals of transcendence as a way of isolating and looking for the religious in a fastly growing secular and a-religious world. And this book is 50 years old. It was way ahead of its time. He was seeing the proverbial writing on the wall. Almost prophetic to a degree in the way he writes about it. So are there regular human gestures that point to something beyond those gestures? And Berger says there are. He calls those things signals of transcendence. But first, what is a signal? Because signal is kind of an amorphous word. It's esoteric. What's a signal? A signal is just something that points beyond itself. In Webster's dictionary, it just says an act or an event or a watchword that has been agreed to as the occasion of another action, something that conveys a notice. These things give us a notice. An object used to transmit or convey information. So we're talking about signals as actions or behaviors that point beyond themselves, that have more in them than even the people who do them believe they do, or know they do. He writes, in, with, and under human projections are indicators of a reality that is truly other, and that the religious imagination of humanity reflects. And signals really do two things. They offer a presence of shared value and a common language between people of faith and people of various or no faiths. So the first thing a signal does is it embodies something that's important to people. And it does so apart from any kind of justification. It's like this given. It's part of our innate sense, our proclivities as people. So there are things that we do that inside of them, they have unspoken value sets. You want to know what people value? Watch what they do. So the presence of a signal represents a shared value through human behavior. Secondly, looking for and noticing these signals, we can see a common language, a place to build bridges with our own faith commitments. Last week we talked about the very end, different maps, that half the world is living with this map of what the world looks like, and we're living with this map. And how do we navigate in the same world with two different maps? And then every map has a thing called a legend or a key. Signals of transcendence are the universal keys to both maps. That's how I want you to think about them. For people that see the world differently, experience the world differently, apprehend it differently, don't share our biblical or theological worldviews, signals of transcendence go back to sort of a pre-denominational, pre-doctrinal, pre-dogmatic origin, in that they're part of human experience and human behavior and natural human proclivities. So that's their two functions. They represent shared value sets that we may share as well, and they help us create a common language to communicate with people who are working with different maps. And this is the list of them, and I'm not going to go through all of them because we only have about 35 minutes. So I'm just going to mention it. But deep symbols or signals. Berger lists 5 signals. He lists order, play, hope, damnation, and humor. And all I'm really going to be able to do with this slide is just tempt you for more, because I really can't get into this in great detail. And then Edward Farley wrote a book about 20 years after Berger called Deep Symbols. And he was a professor, systematic theologian at Vanderbilt. And deep symbols and signals of transcendence kind of have the same function. That's why I include them together. And for Farley, he talked about the presence of tradition, obligation, law, and the real. So what we're looking for are acts and behaviors that if you were to thematize them, organize them, they would fit a category like this. So what sorts of actions and behavior in a person's life testify to the reality of order? For example, when a person wakes up and the time they go to bed, what things do they do that are orderly? And why do they do them? Do they sit around and justify, I think I'm going to order my household today, and here's why. I think I'm going to obey the traffic signs today, and here's why. No. There's this propensity to have an ordered world, for example. Where does the idea or concept of order come from? Why is it there? These are rhetorical, but just to get you thinking about how signals work, how behavior can connect to a broader theme like this and work. So what I did in my work was I identified, rather than going through all of these, because that would have been an entire book and not just a thesis, I identified 5 of these in people that I studied with and wrote about 5, because I couldn't write about 9. And this morning what we're going to do is talk about, in the remaining 35 minutes, 2 of these things. Because I'd like to have a little bit of time for people to ask questions, in case we move too quickly or I don't explain things well enough for us this morning. And this is really where the title for this presentation comes from, the faithful or faithless. Because what we see in these things is there's a lot more faithfulness in non-religious persons than we come to when we look at all of the scary statistics we talked about last week. This is where we see the silver lining. But it takes time. And that's what we'll talk about next week. How do you work within the silver linings? That takes work. When you don't share a worldview, it takes more work to share those silver linings. So, let's get to tradition. So tradition is a broad concept that really refers to embedded practices, rituals, texts, persons, and wisdom that are handed down within a community from generation to generation. So what we're talking about in the practices, the rituals, the texts, etc., is what Pelican describes as tradition being the living faith of the dead. We're putting it to work. We're doing it. It's part of our journey. We're not just going through the motions because we have to. It's not stale, static faith. At least it shouldn't be. That becomes traditionalism for Pelican. So when we're looking for tradition in nons, we're looking for active tradition. We're looking for the things that enliven who they are. Practices, rituals, texts, person, wisdom that they incorporate into their lives for meaning. It may not be the tradition of the Anglican Church. It may not be the tradition fully of Christianity. But it's the presence of traditional sorts of elements that can pull from lots of things. And sometimes it's persons building tradition and not even realize they're building it. Tradition is the being of faith and faith practices. When we go over and do church, if you did this morning, or I will here in a little while, it's the being of our faith. Faith practices taking form and then admonishing to embody and incarnate that faith into the world. So remember what spiritual practices mean, what are meaningful in nons? Things that are done with others. Things that are social. Things that are transformational. Communally. It's the being of that faith and practicing it. The living part of it. That's tradition. But it also gives us a grip in the world. What tradition does is it means we don't have to go back to the drawing board all the time whenever we got to get a grip or get our bearings. In a lot of ways, tradition is a staging ground for action. It's what supports us. It's the stories that guide us. So it's really a vast, huge concept that we're working with. And it relates to the sacred in that usually it happens within a specific community. And what you'll notice about non-religious persons is they're also not absent community. Remember, it's a relational category. They're putting themselves in relationship to other communities. Just not a specific denominational one. So how do we get at this symbol? Well, I had limited time in my study, so I did it through questions and interviews. And one of the questions I asked was kind of benign, kind of mundane. I had no idea it would produce a response like this and the reflections that it gave me. But what I asked was this to one participant. I said, how have the day-to-day patterns of life changed for you from when you were younger to your now older self? So a regular day when you're 20, how's that changed to a regular day now that you're 41? And this is what she said. She said, a good chunk of my 20s, I was a single parent. Get up, go to work, and make sure he's okay, her son. A different dynamic from going from small child to having an adult child. Now, this is where it gets really good. Now we're homebodies. Our home is our happy place. We are collectors. By the time my days are done, I don't want to talk to people. Our house is like a museum. Everywhere I look, I see something that we like or a memory. My son's room is the only room in the house that doesn't have stuff on his walls. A lot of people, when they come into our house, take a deep breath. Our home is a lot for a lot of people. Ever been into a house like that? To me, the home of others do not look lived in. But you come to our house, and you see our personality everywhere. The home is an extension of us. So let me just suggest that maybe another word for tradition is also home. That's why we need them. And if we evacuate them, we build them. So what do you think of when you hear this reply? Just think to yourself. As we move through it, what are some images and things that came to mind as you heard this for the first time and read her description. For me, as I worked through this, and I went back and reflected on it, because when you're doing interviews, you're just transcribing. You're asking questions, you're trying to listen, you want to investigate the story, and you're trying to get it exactly like they say it. And as I went back and I reflected on it, I thought, wow, she's talking about a sanctuary. She's talking about what I'm going to be walking into in about an hour. Relics, objects, memories, things that make her feel safe, things that remind her of her life, provide it meaning and bearing. She feels at peace in this place. That's a very holy element that's mingled in with these mundane material things. And she built it herself. A traditional sort of space in an untraditional way. The same function of almost a church sanctuary, but not a church sanctuary. It's a place that's intentionally crafted to give her a grip in the world. When I come home, I don't want to talk to people. I want to get away from the world. How many of us come to church on Sunday mornings to get away from the world? To be quiet and silent and just breathe. A holy place. That is the presence of remaking tradition. This person doesn't go to church, but still has that same human need for bearings, for holy space. Berger's first book was called Sacred Canopy, and in it he argues that humans construct religion as a canopy over which their civilization is built. That's what she's done. And then there was another story. I asked a spiritual but non-religious a question. I asked everybody got the same questions, but this came from a different question when I asked her, is there anyone you observed as a child that inspires you to go into your current field of work? And without hesitation, this individual said her grandfather, who was a physician. This lady was 51 years old. Grandfather died when she was 12. I asked her a question 40 years later, and this is the first way she responds to that. Is there anyone you observed as a child that inspires you to go into your current field of work? She talked about him as if you describe a God. Warm, caring, inviting, empathetic, omnipotent smile. He built the first local sanitarium in his community. And then she described him with these classic virtues of kindness, generosity, mercy. And he was a Presbyterian. Which means those virtues didn't come from nowhere. Those qualities that she admired and that were motivation for him came out of his faith, his selflessness, his servanthood, his empathy. So the one example she gives is as a exemplar for her current work is someone who is informed by the Christian tradition, even though she's chosen to not be formed by the Christian tradition. Because these things are all transcendent in value. Love, mercy, kindness, generosity. You can't put your finger on those. You can't nail them to the wall. And there's no inherent reason to value these among other things, such as an eye for an eye form of justice, or go into the medical field for capitalistic adventure, for wealth and riches, or to go into the medical field because of a sense of pride or self-esteem. She's deliberately chosen one value set over another value set. And it was grounded in somebody that gave her an example that was formed by tradition, which now she's formed by that tradition. And she's not been an active member of a church ever. And I like to call that the traditionless tradition. So tradition is active. It's just not always active in the way we think it should be when we think of tradition. We say the word tradition and somebody else thinks something static and dead and boring. But tradition is really a whole host and broad range of things that allow us to have a grip in the world and provide meaning. It's a powerful image. Tradition is this quiet voice that guides us, nudging us, and it's present even in non-religious persons. You just got to know where to look. And we are also people of tradition. Probably more multifaceted than we think. We share that in common with people who are non-religious. Now let's go to this concept of play, another transcendent symbol. Now this is a weird thing to talk about on church, playing. Usually we think about sports, we think about play. Yesterday was college football. The whole world stops and focuses attention on the Southeastern Conference. We work all week so we can play on Saturday. But play is really, it's a basic, universal human experience. It's present in all cultures. Every culture, everywhere, has had a form of play. In fact, it's hard to imagine our society without it. Imagine what would happen if we outlawed all play. Humans just want to do it. Kids just want to climb trees. People just want to pick up rocks. You want to kick balls. You want to jump in ponds and swim. It's what you want to do. You don't think about why you want to do it, but you want to play. So play is this universal human experience that points to something beyond it, though. Because it's more than sports. It's more than just relaxation. What we are doing when we play is, for a minute, we're kind of suspending time. Have you ever been so lost in doing something that was fun that you lost track of time? It just slips away. Where did it go? I mean, nothing else matters. You get tunnel vision. It's almost like you're enraptured in what you're doing. And then the day is gone. You see, play carves out this unique space, almost holy, in the way that it works. It suspends time. And for a moment, time and eternity do this when we play. You can't tell the difference. And the intent of play is to, for a moment, for a little bit, to get out of the material world, to search for joy, to participate in something bigger than ourselves. Because we need something more than ourselves. When we play, we forget our problems. It's probably why we play. And we forget our biggest problem, which is death. Probably about 20, 25 years ago, remember the movie Titanic came out? The ship is going down. But there's a small orchestra on the deck of the ship. And what does the maestro, the conductor, have them do? We're all going to die. But let's play. Because playing takes us beyond our death. The cancer patient that's terminal, been working on a book for years. They're going to die in a couple of months. but they still wake up and they work on their book. What's the point? Play. There is something that we only get access to on the other side of play. That you don't get access to apart from it. So it's more than playing. It's really playful. And in a way, it puts us in connection with God in a special place. When I ask people about play in my research, music was a prominent aspect of play. So many people connect with music. You'll have fascinating conversations if you sit down with people and ask them the role of music in their life. It'll sound religious and spiritual. They'll talk about music the way the old-timers used to talk about tent revivals. It carries a lot of religious sentiment, and it does for us too in this church. So I asked the question, what, if any, relationship do you have with music? And one of the participants in my study said this. They said, music is introspective for me. I'm drawn to tonally spiritual music. Someone's lyrics the other night, they got me. Written by Jackson Brown, who I've never appreciated. It was kind of old people music. Even when we were kids, it'd be what our super hip grandparents would have listened to. But it got me. And I listened to that song for 2 hours straight. If it's a 5-minute song, that's like 20 times over and over and over and over. Dude on piano singing a song that wrote 40 to 50 years ago with perfect tone and inflection. I sat for 2 hours and I lost it. I cried for 2 hours. And in that moment, you're all in your feels. Notice the suspension of time in this. This event actually happened after working a 13, 14-hour day at work, pulled into his driveway, this song was playing, and he sat there until 2 a.m. enraptured. It took him into another realm. It pushed up against his own human limits. In a lot of ways, this song, because of the way the interviews were, this song was so powerful for him. At first, it started as entertainment, but it connected with a deep hope he had inside himself. And it sucked him in. And his entertainment turned into something totally other. Now, not all play is that intense, but it all carries that sort of transcendent quality to it. This week is going to be Thanksgiving. A lot of us are going to be cooking, spending a lot of time around family and friends and others. Another notable act of play that was apparent in my interviews was cooking. Cooking can be playful for those who enjoy cooking and who are good at it. We're going to be playing a lot this week. So I asked a participant the same question. I said, so what are you doing when you usually lose track of time? What are you doing that you enjoy so much that you forget where you are? And she said, this usually happens when I'm in my kitchen, barefoot. Moses, what are you doing? You're on holy ground. Take off your shoes. Something's about to happen. Happens in my kitchen, barefoot. I get caught up in something that I really enjoy. Cooking, gardening, decorating cakes, hours and hours go by, and I don't realize it, and I don't even care. Note this language of enjoyment, N-joy. Into the joy the cooking takes me. Caught up. That kind of sounds like a biblical theophany. I was caught up and I saw. And God said. And who is cooking for? Remember what makes something spiritual for nones. It's relational. It's transformational. It's communal. It's for others. Part of the joy and the enrapturement of cooking is who we're cooking with and who we're cooking for. That connects us to more than ourselves. That's how you can be in the kitchen the day before Thanksgiving from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and you turn around and realize, holy cow, we just went through 12 hours. Where did the time go? And then all of a sudden it's next week. And that day spent in the kitchen is ancient history. But you wish you could go back. The moments we want to go back to, those are the holy moments. That's why we want to go back there. We want to build a tent over the holy moments and stay. And following the same line of cooking, one individual said that she likes to go into the kitchen and cook literally because it connects her to her past. A lot of us are going to do that this week. We're going to be cooking and thinking of our parents that maybe aren't here. Our grandparents that aren't here. Her mother's passed away. She says, sometimes I go to the kitchen and I cook to make things my mom would have made so I can remember her. Remember. Put back together what time has pulled apart. So she actually intentionally plays in a way that leads to memories. And remember, the B's of religion, a sense of belonging. One of the B's of religion is belonging. Belief, behavior, and belonging. And cooking in this way for her connects her to that sense of belonging and her past. So she engages in this intentional time travel. Many of us, we may go to the Bible. We may go to the sanctuary. We may go to our favorite place to connect with ourselves. But a lot of people, when they want to go looking for connection, they go to the kitchen. Or they go to their music. Or they go and put their hands in some dirt and feel the earth. And feel that magnetic force field. That energy we get from putting our hands in the very stuff from which all of us were made. And the thing about tradition and play and the work that happens in them is you're not going to encounter people that say, so, I do these things in my life, and this is what I call my traditions. It's not how people talk. It's not how they describe what they do. They're not going to say, oh yeah, I go and play and I do this and I enjoy that in order to. But if you listen to the way they tell the story, and you watch the tears when they tell it, or you see their smiles, you instantly know there is something else going on here. We're not just talking about a football game, or a guitar solo, or cooking banana bread. There is something holy happening underneath this banana bread. This signal, this act, this behavior in these people point to something beyond it that is not empirically justified, that doesn't come packaged with scientific reason, that isn't always rational. But it's true. You want to know what people believe? Watch what they do. So what these signals do is they create a sense of shared humanity with us, people of a specific faith, and those who have either left faith or don't have faith. Those who are non-religious. And I hope I've been able to draw the line to show you all then how tradition and play can have parallels to the life and faith of the church. There are lots of things we do that embody things like tradition. There are things that we do that are playful. And we can connect on all those levels with the way these sort of like pre-theological, if theological means rational construction, these pre-theological experiences and behaviors of people are embodied on a daily life, in our daily life. And that's why I gave my work the title that I did. We're all haunted by transcendence. Even the ones that think that they're not. There's these dust bunnies of a theological era, a godly past from way back that is still very present. And we do things and hold opinions and values and principles that are not the result of the scientific method. And we share this basic humanity, this common language of action with people who are non-religious. And the thing about these signals is they are not subject to the changing cultural winds and moods of society. That's why they're so powerful. Whether we're living in capitalism, socialism, monarchy, first century Roman colonialization, humans have been playing and using tradition and laughing and following law and order all along. And that's where we can connect with individuals, because we share that transcendent, godly seedbed in what we do. And next week, we're going to talk about how to bridge some of these gaps in conversation and approach and storytelling. But at this point, I need to stop because we got about 7 minutes for questions before we need to start making our way over for church. Thank you for your kind attention, and I'm open to any questions anybody may have at this time.
No. Do people on the horizontal look for the vertical as affirmation that there is something more?
I don't think they... First, I can't make a general, broad statement that all people everywhere do X, because people are complicated. But in the research that I've read and a lot of the stories that I've read, I think the intentional looking is horizontal, but sometimes the horizontal looking can give way in the steel dome that is now our immanent world. There might be like a little flicker of light that comes vertically through that steel dome that we've created through our current worldview. So one story that Drescher tells is of an atheist, and he describes the birth of his little girl. And he's like, there's something like wild about this. That it's this regular thing that happens all over the world, all the time. Like tons of people have had babies, but then there's this still really crazy, miraculous thing that happens in it. That makes you think, wow, maybe there is something more. There's got to be something more than just even this impersonal being, this vacuous nothingness. He said, or maybe it's just me hoping for more because I really can't wrap my head around what just happened with this new human being coming into the world. And then he says a very interesting thing. He says, well, I guess for our children, we could probably invent God, couldn't we? So I think this inner longing, so the horizontal, that the act of paying attention that Father Joel has talked about, what I would presume to be decades, I know at least the last 5 years, that giving attention, it can lead to verticality through horizontal relationship.
One of the things I was reflecting on when you first mentioned the vertical and horizontal was how much those orientations parallel that summary of the law: love your God, love neighbor, everything else is common here. That one has that vertical orientation, the other is that horizontal one. And one of the things, it's really handy that two teenagers came in and sat at this table right as I'm about to talk about youth. But one of the things that is that belonging element in a formation period is who are my neighbors? What do they believe? How do they direct me towards God? And Maddie just got back from happening, and that whole sense of here's my community, here are my people, here's where I belong, and that provides those thin places in which that vertical relationship shines through those cracks. It's in that wholesome, life-giving, positive experience of, oh, this is what love is in that horizontal space that we have the inbreaking with that vertical. That's why those two things, love God, love your neighbor, everything else is commentary, resonates so much with me.
Mhm.
Just a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was interesting. Another story that comes up often is that people do feel this sense of more in that relationship. If you listen to people's stories, they'll testify to what you just said. In their loving relationship, with somebody else, family, friends, absolutely, it's going to affirm that. One story that Drescher talks about, a lady actually says it in this way, talking about a gathering. I don't believe in God, but I do believe in this, pointing to her living room with 20 people in it. Well, thank you everyone for your attention, and thank you for sharing this morning with me. Next week we'll come back and talk about how to have faith conversations.
Yes.
Have a great Sunday.